Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Williamson. I'm co-director of the Northeast Pasture Consortium. If you're familiar with the consortium, I took the place of Jim Cropper. We were sad to have Jim retire last year, but we are excited about some of the new ways that the consortium can come together. And today, as you're joining us, this is one of those new ways. So unfortunately, we were unable to see one another face to face this year. So we teamed up with Granite State Grazers and other fantastic organizations across the Northeastern United States to bring you a winter learning series. And essentially, as Emma said, this is the second of a 9-week series where we bring you information on various topics concerning grazing. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jen Colby, and thank you all for taking the time to be here today.
Thanks, Jess. Hello, everyone. I'm Jen Colby. I'm the other co-director of the Northeast Pasture Consortium. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to pass it to Amanda for equine grazing and hope you all have a terrific day.
All right, thank you, everybody. And like everyone else said, thanks for joining us today. I just wanted to do kind of a quick overview of the topics that we will be kind of covering today. As you heard, today we're talking about equine grazing. So what we have is I put together, since we can't really do in-person field days or conferences, I've put together a couple of videos that I went and shot at some local farms here in Maryland. So we have 2 different virtual farm tours that we're going to watch the videos for. And then after that, we'll do kind of a brief presentation and an educational discussion on pasture management. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the first video.
Good morning. I'm Charlie Mess, and my wife Marilyn and I are the owners of Brooke Farm in Olney. We purchased this farm in 1975 when there were fields and farms around us. Now we are the last remaining farm in this particular area. The farm is a horse farm. We have horses that are field boarded as well as stall boarded, total of 42 altogether. Pasture, we have about 85 acres of pasture, and the farm itself is 203 acres. The other being woodland, and we use a lot of that woodland for trails. We did have a harvest of the wood 3 years ago. It was a selective harvest. The farm itself, relating to the pastures, we take soil samples every 3 years to so that we are in compliance with the nutrient management. The pastures are divided. There's 3 groups of horses, and we do rotational pasturing. We do not let the grass get overgrazed, and this has been very helpful. We do fertilize on a yearly basis. Some herbicide is used from time to time, and we use other management practices such as clipping weeds and mechanically weeding that way. We also harrow the pastures after the herd has been moved from one rotation to another. And if there's any areas that are needed for overseeding, we will do that. We've been very fortunate to have available the drill that Soil Conservation has, and we have a nearby seed company. So with the drill and the seed company and so on, we can take care of any spots that that are in need. So I think most people who would look at this pasture right here, this winter pasture, would say that it's in very nice shape, and it is. It's this pasture here that we're in, this field, is used for both grazing and for taking hay. We hay generally once a year. That's all we have to. And I use round bales, and that's done in the latter part of the spring. And then the area will turn this over to rotational grazing. And the way I do it, I have multiple areas off to the east, and I'll mainly graze out there and save this field here for the winter pasture. There are 12 horses that are in this field, and they were moved in here somewhere right around Thanksgiving, and they've done a good job so far in eating it down. We did start putting out our round bale feeders in the beginning of this month, and they are both feeding on the pasture and using the round bales that we made. I have a barn for keeping the round bales instead of having them outside covered that type of way. I find it much better. And we do move the feeders every time we put a new bale in, because they will otherwise wear down the grass and even cause a depression around the area. So it's part of the management, that keeping your pastures in decent shape and allowing the horses to eat on good ground, and it works. It just works. I mentioned before that in this particular pasture there are 12 horses. They are up at the other end right now. This is what I refer to as my winter pasture, where the horses are here from usually November through March, maybe into April, when the grass starts growing again. We move them here because the barn complex is right here, and the people who have their horses have all their saddles and bridles and so on nearby, and it's much more convenient. During the milder months or in summer, we have them off from this area and rotating in different areas, and the people have to go out and bring their horses in. Gives them a little exercise too. I touched on before the drilling, the use of the drill for repairing areas that need to be done, and we use a pasture mix for that, and it's a combination of different types of grasses that are both palatable and sturdy for the animals to use. So now we're in a different pasture, and this is this is the largest pasture I have. You can see over this area. When I do rotational grazing here, I will divide this up into thirds or quarters and rotate the horses through the area. Now, when I set up the rotational pastures, I do use temporary electric fencing for that. I like the use of the electric tape. It's visible. We do put streamers on it, and it's generally battery charged. We have not had troubles with the horses respecting it. They know about electricity, I can tell you. And it's been an easier way to divide the fields. You look in the fields here. on, they have the availability of that. So to kind of further discuss about how we manage the pastures, we do use fertilizer, and it's usually more on an annual basis. Liquid nitrogen I use more than the dry fertilizer. However, when the soil samples show that I need more than liquid nitrogen, then we will use the appropriate dry fertilizer. When we do the soil tests, of course, we look for the main ingredients and also the pH. And my fields have through the years have been very good, and I've not had to add that much lime. My pHs are all within a good range. But when the time comes and we need to do it, I'll use a high magnesium lime. My supplier is Mullinix in Dayton, and they know these fields quite well, and they take good care of them that way once we go over all the data from the soil samples. I clip the fields. I don't let the weeds get up high. We do that at least at the end of a rotation where the horses have eaten down the pasture, and then I'll come in and cut the weeds down. And normally we try not to go too low on the pasture. We like the grass to at least reach a height of 4 to 6 inches when we do mow. And then we use a large harrow, 16 feet wide, that we break up the manure. It's most effective to do it in the warm weather, the summer, when the heat will kill the larvae of the worms. However, we do it all year long. We just after we rotate to break it up. And it looks nice too. I like my fields to look nice. We talked about the fertilizing, but also the herbicides that are used, and I do rely on what the weeds are growing, and I had mentioned before the Mullinix people and soil conservation people on what to use, and generally we have been using 2,4-D and Banville on the pastures for the broadleaf control. And we the pastures are good. They're not perfect. We have horse nettle in there, which seems to be a thing that always comes back, but we're able to keep a lid on it, so to speak. A lot of the other things are easily controlled. So a little bit about the horses, how we manage them. We try to keep things on a low key. We have the two groups of horses, basically the field horses, which are out all day. They can get into a run-in shed, but they are out 24/7. The stall-boarded horses are out in the colder months. We have them out in the day and in at night, and in the warm months we have them reversed, where they're not out in the heat of day, but they are out from the late afternoon through the following morning. And so we do that. We do change that rotation for the horses that are in the stalls. As you see right here, this is the compost pad. The pad itself was funded to a good extent by soil conservation. And what we do is we bring the raw manure out from the stable and have it in this initial row over here. And after several months, we will take the skid loader and turn it over and move it over where this row is right here. And you can see the difference that this has significantly gone through just being in here for about 2 months. I do have a thermometer to measure the temperature here, and that's what we gauge the turning on. The temperature should be above 140 degrees down inside that pile, and when that temperature falls down, then it's time to turn it again. It revives the whole process of decomposing. By the way, the compost is used as a fertilizer on our fields. So there's an empty spot over there. Last week we took the last load out for 2020 to be put onto the fields. After December 15th, you have to cease that type of operation until the spring, March 1st, I believe it is. But we mainly limit the area that we spread this on to an area where regular fertilizer trucks can't get in. And it's worked out quite well. We do use the setbacks 35 feet from the streams, and the process has been good. It's a lot better than the old way when we just took raw manure and spread it, and you would be spreading weeds and worms and everything else. But the composting goes a long way in cleaning all of that up. The barn complex you have right here, this is the stable. There's 13 stalls, a tack room, a wash stall, and behind that is an indoor riding arena, and to the far right is my workshop, my man cave, and we use that for storage of our mechanized equipment. We also use it for social affairs when we can. With the pandemic, it's been very limited, but my daughter, who plays the violin with her children, they'll have a bluegrass festival here a couple of times a year. We've had dinners here. We've had weddings here in the field across the way. Some of the young women who grew up basically at Brooke Grove and riding the farm, and they asked me if they could get married here. And so this, I really enjoy keeping this place in what I feel is good condition, but also having people come and use it. I touched on several of my, 3 of my 4 children were married here. The farm is great. It just, to me, it's always giving. It's always the pleasure of being here, pleasure of meeting the people, interacting, riding. We have beautiful trails, and we do have the indoor arena. We have an outdoor arena, jumps in all the fields and so on. It's quite a place. You should come and visit us.
All right, so that video was of Brooke Grove Farm, as you saw, which is a horse farm in Central Maryland. I did forget to mention that both of these farm visits were filmed around the very end of November / beginning of December. So not the best time of year to be filming a pasture management segment, but I think there was still a lot of valuable information. So I'm going to pull up the other video for our next farm. This farm is also a farm in Central Maryland. This is Persimmon Tree Farm.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Crome, and I run a boarding show facility in Carroll County in Westminster. And I normally have 20 horses here. I have saved them for a little more, but I don't like to keep too many. I like to have a little spare. And I am a person that is really interested in having good pastures because I like turning my horses out. And so the good pasture not only gives them lots of exercise and something to do, but it also cuts down on my maintenance, cuts down on bedding and the amount of hay I have to feed if I have good pastures. So I feel that pastures are very important. So I try to take good care of my pastures here. I try not to overstock them. I have about 40 acres of pasture. So I keep some horses single on pastures, some doubles, and every once in a while I have 3 horses out on my pastures. They run everywhere from 1 acre to 4 acres. So I have big ones and small ones, not real small, obviously. I try to maintain them by keeping them well mowed. So that's something that keeps me from having to use a lot of herbicides and weed treatments. I try to keep them healthy in that I keep them drugged. So I have a big 12-foot drag chain harrow, and I run it around my pastures probably once a month, maybe in the summertime, not quite as often when there's lots of grass. But once I get into the fall, I try to keep those pastures clean of manure piles. So the manure gets spread around and it incorporates into the soil a lot faster. This is just a little different area of my farm, and this shows quite a few paddocks that come together. I really try to not have to use herbicides on my pastures, so I want to keep them fairly weed free. So I do mow them pretty often, and that really helps that particular weed problem that lots of people have in their pastures. And after a few years of being really good at it, you get rid of quite a few of your weeds. I also follow the manure management program, and so every 3 years I run through all these fields and I do soil samples and send them in, and they give me the analysis of what I do have in my soil and what I don't have. And usually it comes back that I need lime, so every couple of years I apply lime to all these pastures. I have someone that comes in and lines them for me, and it really makes a big difference. I usually do it during the winter, so it's a good time because if you use like not dry lime, it breaks down quicker in the winter, freezing and thawing, so it gets into your soil a little faster. Let's see my other management. I also feel that my pasture should be really safe, so I'm a big safety person. I don't like my horses getting hurt, so I have electric fence on all my fields. I might not have it entirely around, but on the traffic-y areas where horses graduate, I try to have electric wire there so they're not chewing on my fences, getting in trouble with my fences. I put my gates along a fence line. I don't like putting them in the corners where the horses can congregate and kick each other and fuss with each other. So I put them in the fence line. It's easier for people too to get their horses in and out. My waterers, which I have several fields that have automatic waterers, but most of my 14 paddocks have just trough waterers. All the fields have frost-free spigots, and they also have electric outlets, so I can put heaters in the winter. I like putting the waterers not in the corner again because I don't like getting groups of horses again fighting over the water, so they're along in the fence line. To keep my gates from getting really deep and muddy, I put stone dust at all the gates, and sometimes I even put stone dust around where my waterers are because that is a high traffic area and you get lots of mud and it's really hard to get your pastures reseeded when you have a lot of mud. So this is a little different area of my farm. So I have some parts of the farm that I don't have in pasture, and a lot of it is in something called conservation, and it's in what we call warm season grasses, which is a clump forming grass, which is really good for wildlife, and it's really good for your soil. And I have 40 acres in that, and I have some other parts of my farm that I have in pollinator habitat. There's a strip in between these two pastures where we have a whole long line of different kinds of flowering plants and some grasses. We just cut that in the spring, and it comes back every year. It hasn't been too difficult to maintain. Also, I leave some little wood lines in a couple of my pastures. So once again, I have little habitat for birds and whatever likes to live on my farm. All the manure that's deposited in my barn that we muck out every day, we store in this manure storage, and we have it hauled off the farm. So there's a good thing that we don't have to spread this on the pastures. We still have plenty of manure deposited on the pastures. We have this hauled off, and it takes about a month to fill this up, and it gets hauled out of here once a month. So you can see it's just been cleaned out. It's makes my manure management process a lot simpler because I don't have to account for all the manure that's spread on my fields, which is more complicated than I want to deal with. This is just a little view of some of the conservation practices I have on the farm. These are warm season grasses. This is a little bit what they look like in the winter. And we have to maintain them, which is fairly simple. They don't have to be fertilized or any of that. They can't be grazed at this point, and not making hay out of this. So I have to mow it every year, and if I choose to burn it, I have burned it. This field was burned last year, so we will be mowing it this year. And you just mow it in the late winter before nesting season, and it comes back every year. This prep program right here has been in 15 years, and it has some wildflowers in it, but it's mostly warm season grasses, and they get quite tall, and they're great habitat for wildlife. All right, this is a pasture where it's got a big hill to it, so it has great drainage, which is nice, but it's also a pasture that gets a lot of usage, especially up where the gate is and up where the barn is. So when I rent a cedar from the Soil Conservation District, I particularly overseed the places in my pasture that have taken a beating over the winter, the sparser places, the places that have had a lot of traffic and the grass has been just worn away. So you can take a look at this area here. This area, particularly up by the gate and along that fence line, gets a lot of wear and tear. So that's definitely a prime place where we reseed. Most all of the fields we have to reseed heavily around the gate area. And you can see that some of the grass is held up well. So just depends on what particular part of your pasture that you gets a lot of wear and tear. But I do it every year. I use regular pasture mix, and I mix with it something called Max Q, which is a short Kentucky fescue. It really takes hold when you plant it. You can see it coming up in the little rows from the cedar, and it stays, and I'm really happy with that. I also don't keep horses out of my pasture 24 hours a day. These horses are all on a schedule. In summer, they go out at night, so they go out at 4 and they come in at 6. And this is the winter, so we're on in during the night and out during the day. They go out around 6, and they come in between 3 and pastures don't have horses on them 24/7. A lot of people don't have that luxury, but you have to maintain your pastures, because if you let them get down, then it's really hard to get a good base in them. This pasture gets more traffic than most. It's a smaller one, and so we feed hay in here to try to give it a little break. And we also are careful about not putting too many horses in there. So you can see the grass in there is very short. They've grazed it down. Some of the grasses are not that edible, and they don't really graze on it, even though you think you have pasture. It's not that edible. They really like some grasses better than others. So you have to be thinking about that and not just looking at your pasture and say, oh, it looks really green, it must be really nutritious. That's not really always the case. Pastures basically are not free. They require maintenance, and so maintaining them is pretty constant. You can't just let them go and get really in bad shape and then have to just empty them totally of horses and leave them for time for your grass to grow. It's better to try to keep up with it all the time.
Okay, hope everybody, got a few new tips or tricks from those virtual farm tours. And I apologize, if the volume wasn't quite as loud as you wanted it to be, but there's only so much you can do with technology, I guess. So now I do see that Carolyn is here with us today, but we will have a little bit of time at the end for kind of Q&A or discussion if people have questions. But before we get into that, I just really briefly wanted to go over kind of some of the main points behind a lot of the things that you saw on those 2 pasture management visits. So I will share this. So this is going to be kind of like the why behind the things that you saw on those virtual farm tours. So, here's the 2 farms we toured, Brooke Grove and Persimmon Tree Farm. And, what you'll notice that those 2 farms had a lot of similarities in some of the different management practices that they talked about. They both do soil testing to figure out their fertility needs. They both use mowing or clipping as a method to control weeds in their fields. They both use a harrow or a drag of some sort to kind of break up manure and spread that across the field. They both try to avoid overgrazing as much as they can, but also recognize that there are fields near the barn that are the most abused or that are going to be abused, and those can be overseeded as needed. They both mentioned seeding with a pasture mix, so a diverse stand of forage species, and then they both feed hay on the pasture in the wintertime. But when we think about kind of, some of the differences between the 2 farms, we saw that Brooke Grove, Dr. Mess mentioned he had, 42 horses on 85 acres. Carolyn said she had 20 horses on 40 acres. So really that comes out to kind of a very similar stocking rate of 2 acres per horse, which is a really good starting point when you're starting to think about size and spacing for horses. One thing that they did differently is they used that 2 acres per horse in a slightly different way. So Dr. Mess at Brooke Grove Farm, he uses more of a rotational grazing strategy and rotates the horses across those different paddocks or pastures. And Carolyn talked about how she overseeds annually, especially in areas that are more heavily used, and she uses a more limited turnout schedule to try to ease the use on those fields. Some of the other differences, Brooke Grove, Dr. Mess mentioned using compost as a way to help break down the manure and then spread that on his field as a nutrient source. And a round bale, he uses round bales with feeders and moves those around, which we'll talk about in a minute. And at Persimmon Tree, Carolyn hauls the extra manure from the barn away, so she doesn't have to worry about it. And she uses primarily small square bales. So really I wanted to kind of highlight, some of these key differences because when we think about, how to set up a farm and how to manage a farm and what to do with a grazing program, there's really a lot of different ways we can go about it, right? So one of the first things that I always ask people is, what are your goals? Do you want to try to increase the number of animals you can support? Do you want to improve your forage availability, make that forage available for a longer time of the year, reduce your feed costs, look into things like, soil erosion benefits and maybe some conservation practices? There's a whole host of different goals, and that will kind of be the driving force behind how you want to set up and manage a pasture system. The other important consideration is resources. What resources do you have in place as far as land, space, water, labor, infrastructure, and how do you want to manage that? So we know that management options can range from something very simple up to something very intensive, right? On one end of the spectrum, we have a continuous grazing system where we have no rotational grazing. Our animals have access to that entire field. We can kind of, move that into a little bit more of a intensive or moderate managed system and think about, maybe subdividing that field into quarters and rotating those animals through those 4 different sections. Or we can, take this a step further and we can really get intensive with it and rotate them much more frequently and subdivide even further. And this is all going to depend on, your goals for your facility and where you want to move forward and how you want to do so. So when we think about pasture management, a lot of times we'll see a field like this or like this, and we'll think, oh, okay, this field is green. I can see, there's grass growing on the whole field. But unfortunately, when we look a little bit closer, a lot of times this is kind of how fields first look when they're, moving from being a well-managed field into kind of that overgrazed or poorly managed field. So, the grasses get shorter. Eventually that leads to, those bare areas opening up as those forages cannot withstand that grazing pressure. And it's important to note that there is no forage species that's going to persist if our pastures are continually overgrazed. So if we don't implement some form of pasture management, eventually we're going to end up, with one massive dry lot, basically. So really what this comes down to is good pasture requires good management. And this can offer, the whole host of benefits, things that were mentioned in those videos, things that we'll be talking about, in the rest of this presentation, but improving the integrity of the pasture, the longevity of the pasture, helping with those soil or conservation benefits, increasing the productivity and the quality of the forage in those pastures. So what we're going to do for this presentation is go over just briefly, I think there are 6 kind of basic best management practices that I like to focus on if people are looking to improve their grazing or kind of take their management to the next level. First and foremost is soil fertility. So you heard soil fertility come up in both of those videos. Both Carolyn and Dr. Mess, take regular forage sample or soil samples, and have those analyzed so they know what nutrients are present in their soil. And this is because we know that soil fertility plays such a critical role in our forage systems. So, you see this whole list of things here that are all involved with soil fertility, forage establishment, root growth, the amount of nutrients that those forages can uptake, yield, the vigor of that stand. All these things are associated with the fertility in that soil. So to kind of illustrate that a little bit, we know, first and foremost that soil pH affects the utilization of other minerals. So you heard them both talk about, looking at their soil pH and applying lime if their soils get a little bit too acidic. And the reason this is under an acidic condition, we have a reduced availability of some of those key essential nutrients, things like phosphorus, calcium, magnesium. Those all become less available to the plant as our soil gets more acidic or as our pH gets lower. At the same time, some of the nutrients that we might not necessarily want to be more available, things like iron or copper, they become more available as our soil gets more acidic. And that's where we can get, increased potential for toxicity or higher concentrations in our forages. So really for most of our forages, the optimum pH kind of falls between that 6 to 7 range. The other thing to think about with soil fertility is it doesn't, the pH doesn't only affect, just the availability of those nutrients, but it also has an effect on root growth and root development in a plant. So in a more acidic soil, those roots are not as able to extract nutrients from the water and from the soil. There's less mineralization of organic nitrogen. There's less nitrogen fixation. You know, if we have legumes like clover or alfalfa that are capable of fixing nitrogen in our forage stand. And you can see from the image on the right, you know, the effects of that soil acidity on the root growth of those forages. So here is, you know, just an example. This is a photo from down in North Carolina, but I just wanted to give you kind of a visual perspective of the difference in, you know, no soil fertility versus soil fertility. So these two pictures are from the same field, the same ground, you know, same, you know, crop history. Everything was the same, other than they took soil samples, and for the field on the right, they added the nutrients according to their soil test. And for the field on the right, or the left, excuse me, they did not add any nutrients. And you can see the difference in the new planting and in, you know, how much forage growth was there just based on that simple change in fertility. So I kind of stole this slide from another forage specialist, Dr. Dennis Hancock. He used to say, you know, the most common cause of poor establishment is soil pH and or fertility is too low. Most common cause of poor forage persistence is soil pH and or fertility is too low. And the most common cause of things like poor drought tolerance are soil pH and or fertility is too low. So really that's always the first thing to check. We want to have, you know, good, balanced, healthy soil to have that optimum, you know, establishment, production, and persistence of our pastures and our forages over time. One other thing before we kind of move off of fertility is kind of thinking a little bit about the nutrient cycle. So we know, you know, in the soil, we have this cycle of nutrients that's happening. We have things coming into that cycle and things leaving that cycle. You know, for example, things that might be going into our nutrient cycle are, you know, mineralization of, you know, nutrients in the soil. So kind of that natural turnover, that natural mineralization. Fertilizer that we may be adding, manure that we may either be adding or may be deposited from our livestock, feed or minerals that are fed on a pasture can provide a source of nutrients, nitrogen fixation by legumes. And then on the other hand, we have, you know, outputs that are going out of that field or leaving that field. And these are things like if we harvest a forage and remove that forage from the field, livestock will remove some, you know, livestock products that are taken off the field. Those will remove some nutrients. And then we have loss pathways. You know, we have things like runoff and leaching that we try to minimize, but there will always be a little bit of loss happening in this cycle. So the thing with soil fertility is because it's a cycle, we really want to maintain that balance. If we fall on the end of having our outputs be greater than our inputs, what we're doing is really mining that soil for nutrients. And we know that harvesting or grazing forages does remove nutrients, and we need to keep that in mind when we're thinking about our fertility needs. One thing I will say that is a pro for grazing is, you know, under a hay production setting, we're removing a lot more of those nutrients from that soil. By taking that forage growth and removing it from that field, we're taking away a lot of those nutrients. And of course, you know, the higher the yield we have of that hay, the higher or the more amount of nutrients are being removed. So you can just see some examples of, you know, a table with some of the kind of average removal of different nutrients by our different forage types, and those are on a per ton basis. Under a grazing setting though, we have a lot less removal because we have some nutrient cycling, because we know that what goes into the animal also comes back out, right? So a lot of those nutrients are kind of recycled through that animal and redeposited onto that field through manure or urine. But one thing to think about from a grazing management standpoint is how uniformly are those nutrients being redistributed. So we know that, you know, livestock don't always, you know, deposit their nutrients evenly across the field. You may have seen fields that look like this before with, you know, little clumps here and there from places where, you know, manure or urine was deposited. And we know that livestock like to congregate, and they like to, you know, stand in the shade or stand around a water source or stand around a gate. And so a lot of times that leads those areas to be, have a higher concentration of nutrients versus other areas that they may tend to avoid. So a really interesting kind of study that was done. They looked at the amount of years it took to get one manure pile per square yard on a pasture. And under a continuous system, so the livestock had access to that full field, it took 27 years to get one pile of manure per square yard. Under a rotational system, we can see that be decreasing as we're kind of, making those animals move from area to area and spend more time in areas where, they may not otherwise have spent as much time. So we can get it down, to 1 to 2 years with a one-day rotation. Also keep in mind the same kind of concept applies to hay feeding. How are those nutrients redistributed? So they've done work looking at, different hay feeders and looking at kind of nutrient deposition across the field. So you can see from this figure, with one stationary hay ring, you can tell right from looking at this image where that hay ring was, because all those little spots are where the nutrients were deposited. Versus if we either move that ring around or unroll our hay, we can kind of help disperse those nutrients across that field. And this is where something like what Dr. Mess was talking about, where he said he moves his hay feeders from place to place. This is helping with the redistribution of those nutrients across that field. And you can see here, you can actually see it in like the Google Earth or the aerial view, how those nutrients are kind of, being placed or moving across those fields under those different situations. So the summary there is, it's good to feed our hay on places that are kind of nutrient poor to add some nutrients back to that area, and also to move our feeding spots around. So we're kind of spreading those nutrients around back onto the soil. So moving on from soil fertility to kind of our other best management practices. Number 2 is use rotational grazing. We've already kind of touched on this, but we have our different grazing management systems. And we know that under a continuous grazing system, the animals will tend to select, what they like. They'll tend to go to places in the field where they prefer to be, and they will continue to graze in those places. So what this results in is a lot of those good plants or those desirable plants disappearing, and more of our less desirable plants, whether they be weeds or just kind of other undesirable forages, are left. And this has an influence on the utilization of the forage within a field. So what percent of that field are those animals actually utilizing or actually grazing? And, they say that under a continuous grazing situation, we're really actually only using maybe 30 to 40% of the forages or the forage within that field. If we switch from that to a rotational system, whether it be simple or more intensive, again, that kind of depends on management preferences. But what we're doing by switching is controlling the time that those animals spend in one given area and allowing the other areas time for recovery, allowing for kind of more even grazing throughout the field, and again, distributing those nutrients more evenly back across the field. And by doing that, we're increasing our utilization. We're increasing the amount of forage we're able to use from that field. So people always ask, if I'm going to start rotational grazing, how do I know when to rotate? Well, we know that with forages, we have this yield and quality trade-off, right? So as forages grow and get more mature, they have an increase in their forage yield, but the forage quality is declining. So we have this inverse relationship between yield and forage quality. And really, we try to think that the best time to graze is usually kind of where we can find a happy medium, where we can balance having good forage quality, but also having good forage yield. As far as what that means in terms of an actual plant height, that will depend a little bit on what types of forages you have growing in your field. So I don't expect you to read all of this, but they have established recommendations for different forage types, and the target begin grazing height, or the target height for when we should be grazing those forages. And since a lot of our area is predominantly cool season perennials, I just pulled out a few of those, and you can see that, it does vary a little bit, but on average, if we kind of shoot for that, 6 to 10 inch range, that's kind of where maybe we'll try to hit that sweet spot. So after rotational grazing, and this kind of goes along with rotational grazing, is allowing for adequate rest. So we know that rest is really important for our forages. In a continuously grazed pasture, most of those plants are going to be grazed every 2 to 7 days. So again, those livestock are going to go back and repeatedly consume that same plant. This is harmful from the plant perspective because those plants really need that time to regenerate their carbohydrate reserves. So they need to replenish those energy reserves in order to be able to continue to regrow. So we know that proper rest following grazing is key and does allow for a quicker plant recovery. To visualize that a little bit, here is some plants that were grown in a greenhouse over at the University of Kentucky. The pot on the left was clipped every week to 1 inch. So that's to kind of simulate a more continuous grazing system. And the pot on the right was clipped once a month to 3.5 inches. So that was to kind of simulate more of a rotational grazing system. And this photo was taken on the day that they clipped those plants. So day 1. And 6 days later, here's what the regrowth looked like on those very same plants. You can see that the regrowth is much quicker from the plant that has had that adequate rest period versus the one that has been clipped every single week. So along the same lines, allowing for adequate rest also kind of helps what's going on below the surface. So we know that in addition to, hampering the growth above the soil surface, repeated grazing is also shortening the growth of the roots below the surface. And this is leading to, things like less tolerance to drought, less nutrient uptake, just an overall, less persistent plant. So that rest is really important, also for the roots of that plant to allow them to regenerate and redevelop. And we know that, healthy roots will make those plants more able to handle weather extremes or injury. And they will also help contribute to more of the natural turnover of a healthy root system, which helps, do things like build soil organic matter. So again, you can see in the image, the plant on the left was cut down to a 2-inch grazing height every week versus in the middle every 2 weeks versus on the right every 4 weeks. And that extended rest period for that plant on the right allows it not only to have more robust growth above the soil surface, but also more robust root growth below the soil surface. So how do we accomplish this? Well, that's where the rotational grazing comes in. That allows us to provide time for those different paddocks to be rested in between grazings. And, if you don't have enough space or, the paddocks haven't been able to be rested for long enough and you are in need of somewhere to put your animals, that's oftentimes where people use something like a sacrifice area that they can put the horses into when, the pastures are still requiring some time to regrow. And, the length of that rest period is going to depend a lot on, a whole bunch of factors like, what kind of forages you have growing, how healthy your forage stand is, the weather, the time of year, all of those things play a role in that. So number 4 is to keep our pastures vegetative. We know that forage maturity plays such an important role in forage quality. So again, those vegetative, more leafy forages are going to be higher in quality, and those mature or more stemmy forages are going to be a little bit higher in fiber. So, that might look a little something like what you see on the left for a more vegetative versus what you see on the right for a more mature forage. And this is important not only because we want to provide our animals with, good quality forage, but also because we know that animals and in particular horses are very preferential. And this often results in a lot of variability throughout the field. So you may see fields like what you see in the photo there, where there's areas where they've grazed, everything down to the dirt, and there's areas where they've left, grass that's really tall. And so one of the strategies that we can use to kind of help minimize this and help keep those pastures in a more vegetative state is using something like mowing or clipping to kind of keep those grasses in a vegetative state. You heard, both of the farm farm visits that we saw today, they both talked about using mowing or clipping to help keep those forages nice and vegetative, and then also for the added benefit of helping with weed control. So number 5 is to maximize our green leaves. And you may kind of wonder, okay, what does that really mean? Well, if we think about what does a plant need to grow, we know that plants are basically converting, sunlight or energy from the sun into, glucose and oxygen and, things that plant can use to grow. So if we think about it in this perspective, those plants are kind of acting like miniature solar panels, right? They're capturing that, energy from the sun, and they're turning it into a usable form of energy for the plant. And if we think about them as solar panels, we can also think, where does that energy for regrowth come from, after a grazing bout? Well, that energy for regrowth can come from the remaining leaf area on that plant. So, we said those leaves are able to photosynthesize, but only, green or growing leaves can actually carry out that photosynthesis process, which means that, a picture like what you see on the bottom image has a much higher photosynthetic rate than what you see in the top image. So the more leaf area that's remaining in those plants, the more they're able to photosynthesize and regain their energy quicker. The other area that energy can come from a plant is stored carbohydrates. So for most of our cool season grasses, they store their energy reserves in the stem base. So, the lower 3 to 4 inches of that plant. And this can serve as, another source of energy for that plant. And they can use it when they need to, regrow after a grazing bout. So if we think about from that perspective, if we use a lower grazing height, or, we have less green leaves remaining, if you will, there's our lower grazing height. This will leave less leaf area for that plant to photosynthesize. So that plant is, has a lower rate of photosynthesis. It's not, making energy as quickly. And it will also leave less stored carbohydrates remaining in that plant because we've removed some of that stem, the lower stem where those plants are storing that energy. So we have a smaller green leaf area, and we have, lower energy overall. With a slightly higher grazing height, we can kind of reverse that a little bit. So we have more leaf area for photosynthesis to occur, and we have more stored carbohydrates remaining. So kind of maximizing, the energy capability of that plant and making that plant much more tolerant to, different pressures that it may, see, like drought or, things like that. So having this, keeping this kind of grazing height in mind, we can kind of also, again, look at it from the below ground perspective. So we know that as we remove more and more of that top growth, not only are we depleting that energy, but we're also stopping the roots from continuing their growth cycle. So the more leaf area that we remove from the top, the more we stop the roots from continuing to grow down below. So in order to keep those, roots healthy and growing, we want to leave, roughly 50% of that top growth to keep those roots happy and growing. And again, those, shallower or less extensive root systems will make that plant more vulnerable to things like heat, drought, insect, or disease stress. So finally, if we kind of compile all of that into one thing, and we look at the effect of residual height, or you could say, grazing height in this instance, on the growth rate of that plant. They did some research, and they have shown the red solid line that you see is kind of the daily growth rate. So the amount of pounds per acre per day that plant is putting out, or that plant is growing. So you can see that when we cut those forages at a 2-inch height, the growth rate of that plant as a response to that is a lot lower. If we cut or graze them at a slightly higher height, the growth rate or response is a lot higher. And this comes down to a difference of, let's see, 3 weeks, roughly, that it took those 2 different grazing heights to grow back to 1 ton. So the moral of the story is, if we leave a little bit of extra forage in that field, we're going to regrow faster because we've saved a little bit of that energy. So this is where a lot of those sayings come from that you may hear, grass grows grass, take half, leave half. It really is kind of getting down to this fundamental that if we leave a little bit more in the field, we're going to kind of gain the benefits on the backside. And this will also affect the persistence of those forages over time. So, this is cutting height, but you could just as easily, swap out for grazing height. This was orchard grass in particular. They looked at the persistence of that forage over time at different cutting heights or, different grazing heights, if you will. And you can see that when we used a slightly higher grazing or cutting height, we had a much greater persistence in years down the road. All right, last but not least, the last point is to control weeds. So we know that weeds compete with our forages for light and nutrients and moisture and space. So it's important that we try to maintain a healthy forage stand to outcompete those weeds and keep them from encroaching. We know that clipping or mowing can be an effective strategy to kind of eliminate the seed heads, especially on any of our annual weeds, and kind of prevent them from reproducing in that way. And then we can also use herbicides. We have a number of herbicides available, but this will depend a little bit on what weeds we have present in our field and which ones we're looking to control. So there you have 6 grazing best management practices to follow. Easy peasy, right? So I know I kind of went through all of that fairly quickly. I didn't want to keep us too much over our time. But I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions if there are any. Any news on Pro-Clova approval at the EPA? Yeah, so that's a really good question. For people who might not be familiar with what Pro-Clova is, there's a new herbicide that's going through the EPA approval process right now. And the goal or the point of that herbicide is to kill or get rid of broadleaf weeds, but maintain clover. So traditionally, any of the broadleaf weed herbicides that we use, like the ones Dr. Mess mentioned, 2,4-D and dicamba, those will kill broadleaf weeds, but they will also kill the clover in a stand. So there's a new herbicide called Pro-Clova that's supposed to help with that by maintaining the white clover. And they had an update at the American Forage and Grassland Council meeting, which was back in January. And basically the news was that Pro-Clova, the approval from EPA has been delayed because of coronavirus and the pandemic and all of that kind of stuff. So they're looking to, I think, either late 2021 or early 2022 before that's actually going to get approved. So we'll have to wait just a little bit longer on that one.
I saw that question on here, and I actually sent a text to one of the field scientists with their range and pasture division, and he said that as of right now, it's not going to happen in 2021. So at the earliest, early 2022.
Okay, good to know. Thanks. Okay, we had someone said, I'm wondering as we learn more about the dangers of lush pasture on our equine population with obesity, laminitis, and insulin resistance on the rise, how are we balancing the need for lower quality, more diverse forage with our desire to cultivate green, weed-free, and aesthetically pleasing pastures? So that's a really great question, and it brings up a couple of really great points. One of which is it's really important to know your horses and what types of horses you have on your facility, because if you do have horses that fall into that population of laminitic, insulin resistant, metabolic syndrome type horses, that's where kind of the need to look into more of that comes up. If you don't, then you don't have to worry about that quite as much. So when it comes to those types of horses, you know, there's a number of different kind of management strategies that you can implement to try to help with that. One of actually the most common misconceptions that I see is those pastures, you know, sometimes people have said, you know, I want my pasture to be overgrazed because I don't want very much forage out there for my insulin resistant horse to eat it. When actually, you know, those tiny little baby leaves that are growing out of the ground that horse is continuously nibbling, you know, over and over again, those have a really high non-structural carbohydrate or sugar concentration, and that can be really detrimental. So actually going through, you know, and using good management and maintaining a stand that's healthy can be helpful with that. As far as the diverse forage, I think that your point brings up a lot of weight. There is, I think, more and more people who are becoming more interested and realizing the benefits of having a diverse forage stand. You know, you heard both of the farm visits today, they said that they planted a pasture mix. So people are looking more and more into doing kind of those mixtures and kind of incorporating diversity into their stand that way. We had someone said, I'm used to ruminants. Has anybody done strip grazing with horses and been able to avoid founder? That's a really good question. I don't actually know of any particular association between strip grazing and founder. I don't know if any of our other, if Jess or anyone has, you know, has heard of that association before. I would think you would be perfectly able to do strip grazing with horses, you know, as long as you're doing it properly and not have, you know, any health concerns coming up with that. We have some really hard to answer questions like how many horse farms in Maryland are using rotational grazing? I honestly have no idea. You know, I'm still relatively new to Maryland, so I haven't been here for a super long time. I would say the majority are probably not using rotational grazing, but we're hoping that, you know, things like today can help start to convince people to do otherwise, even if it's just, you know, simply subdividing a field into two and flipping, you know, 1/2 to 1/2. You can already, you know, start to see the benefits from rotational grazing. We had someone ask about paddock sizing for horses. They said for cattle, it's based on the amount of forage needed to meet nutritional needs. For groups of horses, what size do you recommend so horses don't blow through fences? Also, do you recommend use of temporary fencing? So I have actually used temporary fencing with horses quite a bit. When I was a graduate student, we used temporary electric netting. It's kind of like the ones that you see for sheep and goats, but the hole sizes were a little bit bigger and it was a little bit taller. But we used that electric netting for all of our research pastures because we were constantly moving horses to different research plots to graze different things, and, you know, grazing, you know, 1 rep at a time, all those different kinds of things. So we used temporary fencing a lot. It was sometimes a little bit of a pain if it would get tangled around itself. But as long as, you know, the fencing was hooked up to the electricity, we really had no issues with the horses going through that temporary fencing. That probably depends a little bit on your horse. You know, I'm sure there are some horses out there that will blow through anything temporary as much as possible. So keep that in mind. And again, you know, that you kind of have to, you know, tailor some of these things to your individual farm and what's going on with that. As far as pasture sizing, again, that also kind of depends on your horses. You know, if you have a group of horses that can get along relatively well with each other, you'll be okay doing a slightly smaller area, versus if you have, you know, horses that are going to, start to fight or kick or hurt each other. If they get into a little bit closer proximity, then you're going to have to go into, a little bit of a larger area. But I think in general, a lot of people who size paddocks for horses make them, really large, and we probably could pare down on our paddock sizing. Someone asked how much land do you need for rotational grazing? They only have 2 acres of pasture and 1 horse. So you can do rotational grazing on any size of land. This kind of ties back to, the paddock sizing question from earlier. With 2 acres of pasture and 1 horse, you could divide that in half and have 2 1-acre pastures. You could divide that into, 4 sections and have 4 half-acre pastures. Either of those options would be perfectly appropriate. And then, I always suggest kind of starting small. So, start with 1 or 2 subdivisions, and then, see how it goes, get a feel for kind of the temporary fencing or however you're going to, whatever you're going to use to subdivide it, and then, proceed from there. And you may find that, it gets easier over time as you get more used to it and as your horse or horses get more used to it. And I see someone else had said that they used a polywire with great success. So I think the key with the temporary fencing and the electric fencing is making sure that you have, a good source of electricity and a reliable source of electricity. As long as you have that, horses, all livestock, horses included, really, in my experience, have respected it very well. You heard Dr. Mess said that he used the electric tape. So it was, a little bit wider, a little bit more visible. I've used polywire with my horse. I've also used, as I said, the electric netting. So you have different options and you can kind of figure out what works well for you. Any tips for when overgrazing is unavoidable? 2 horses on 4 acres, but 3 acres are wooded and thus not available as a grass pasture. Yeah, so that's really hard. When you have a really high stocking rate per acre, that's really the hardest type of situation to manage. The best things that you can do are try to use some of the strategies kind of that Carolyn Chrome mentioned in her video. So, you saw that she has, limited grazing to, certain hours of the day. She kind of plans to reseed those fields fairly regularly, especially in areas that get overused or, are closer to the barn and are more heavily used. And, you're just going to kind of, in that situation, unfortunately, you're going to have to kind of plan to have to do a little bit of more input, moving forward. There's really only so much you can do when you're really limited on land capacity. That being said, I would definitely also, if you aren't already, try to do, some sort of kind of rotational grazing if you have enough space to do so. Even just, dividing the current area in half and, flipping from half to half, you're already, basically doubling the amount of rest that pasture is going to get on one side versus the other. And you may find that starts to increase your productivity, and then you may want to add, a 3rd split in there, and assuming your horses get along. So yeah, it's very tricky when you're really short on land, but trying to follow kind of some of those practices that we talked about today, and then just knowing that, kind of setting that forage up for the best that you can. So, making sure your fertility is good, planning on doing a little bit of overseeding when it's needed. Those kinds of things can help that a little bit.
It looks like that's all the questions we have. Unless there's anything last minute, we really appreciate you taking the time, Amanda. It was really great, and that was a lot of great input from our attendees, so we appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for having me.